Welcome back, and today we're going to talk about one of the attachment styles known as the anxious preoccupied. So, the statistics and estimates put this about 20% of the population, and I'm going to bring you back to that original story I told you when I was figuring out people's behaviors and putting them into two groups before I knew about attachment theory. This was the group that I called the clingers and the puppy dogs. And the reason why I called them that is because what I saw at 16 years old in early adulthood was that these people clung to their partners and that they almost acted like puppies, where they'll do anything that you ask them to do. It doesn't even matter whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. They're just going to sacrifice whatever for your happiness. So that's why I called them clingers and puppy dogs. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about how this develops, what we see in relationships, and some of the things you can do that you might want to work on, moving towards a secure attachment. Our anxious attachers had a little bit of a different childhood than our secure attachers. So for these individuals, caregiving and getting their emotional needs met was actually very inconsistent. So sometimes their parents were very warm, loving, emotionally supportive, and other times not so much. So it kind of left them with this impression of like, when is it coming back? Now, other theorists in psychology have shown us that intermittent reinforcement is a really powerful thing for our brain. It can always keep us coming back for more, even when we don't know if we're getting more. So, that intermittent reinforcement that these individuals got in childhood really kind of leaves them looking for more, keep coming back, even though they don't know if they're going to get the treat that they're looking for. So that's what we saw for them. And what ended up happening is that they developed this blueprint of themselves and others that's a little off kilter compared to the secure attachment. So the working model of self here is low. It's that I'm not lovable and I can't get my needs met in relationships. But the working model of others is really high. So others are trustworthy, others are going to be there when I need them to be. So when they're walking around, not just in relationships, but also in life, this is the narrative that is constantly circulating in the back of their brain and basically guiding just about everything that they're doing in their world. So it's this constant viewpoint of I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I can't get this met, and I need to depend on others to provide all of this stuff for me. And you can kind of understand how if that's the narrative that's always in the back of your head and that's your guiding blueprint, this is going to show up in your romantic relationships, your friendships, your coworkers, and it is going to cause a little bit, maybe a lot of bit of headaches, concerns, and problems for you. And it might be something you might want to consider working on. So what's the dance that we see from our anxious attachers? Well, if we go back to that Colin and Reed's revised adult attachment scale that I love, we would see a very high need for closeness and dependency, almost to the point, if not at the point of codependency. And we would also see really high relationship anxiety. These people are genuinely afraid that their partners are going to abandon them, but it's different than what you would see in a fearful avoidant. These people are afraid of being abandoned because they're not too good at being alone. Because again, they have that high need for dependency, that their needs in a relationship have to be met by somebody else. So you can kind of see how this is going to present some problems when we actually get into romantic relationships and into their relationship with themselves, because that narrative, of course, is that, I'm not lovable, I'm not able to get my needs met in a relationship, I have to have somebody else do this for me. So they're really going to have this pressure, this need for closeness, for dependency, and they're going to have this high anxiety because if you leave me, I don't know what I'm going to be able to do myself. Like I can't do that is kind of this prevailing thought. So while you could see that fear of abandonment in like a fearful avoidant, it's going to look ever so slightly different than it would from an anxious preoccupied. And this was a mistake I made a few years ago because I would tell people like, oh, well, I have a fear of abandonment. Now I understand it's actually a very different kind of anxiety than the actual anxious, preoccupied fear of abandonment. The fearful avoidant has more of that betrayal wound that's going to become a problem that's going to look a little bit more like abandonment. So it's really interesting when you see how this actually starts to show up in our romantic relationship. So for our anxious attachers, they're probably going to have some communication difficulties. They might be able to identify what they need in a relationship, but they're going to struggle to be able to communicate that because that fear of abandonment, that high relationship anxiety, is going to kind of almost like choke the words to say, like, hey, if I talk about what I need, my partner might leave me, or my needs are too much. I can't ask for what I need because my partner might leave me. So that fear might actually squash their ability to really directly communicate their needs. And in a conflict, they're going to be a little bit more likely to self-sacrifice and self-abandon themselves and just be like, whatever my partner wants, I'll just give my partner whatever they want, even though this is not good for them. And they're basically abandoning themselves in that process. They're also going to struggle with that repair because, again, they don't want to make too many waves. They don't want to create too many problems. They just want their partners to stay. And so all of this is going to kind of show up, and it's going to create some issues because as this continues to build, eventually you're going to start to see some of that protest behavior where they're trying to get their partner's attention to understand what they need, but they can't always directly communicate that, and they're afraid of the conflict. Maybe they're concerned not really having the skills to repair. So all of this is going to kind of really play in together when they get into these relationships. And you can see how this is going to be a bigger issue when we talk about some of the avoidance and how this can set up a cycle, a joint dance that's actually going to be a big problem in their relationships. So you could also see some of the horsemen coming in. When you get these protest behaviors, they may come in real hot in these arguments and really come in very critical as they protest. But at that point, they've kind of really hit their limit. They're really frustrated with what's going on. They're not going to have the same self-regulation skills that a secure attacher is going to have. They're going to depend a little bit more on co-regulation. So when they're emotionally upset, they're gonna kind of look to their partner to kind of help regulate that. And I'll give you some examples of how I have seen this show up in my world. So when it comes to our anxious attachers, what do we actually see? What were the examples that I've seen? So first of all, let's just recap. Anxious attachers had inconsistent caregiving. They have that low working model of self, high working model of others. I can't get my needs met. I have to depend on everybody else to meet my needs. They also have a really high need for closeness and dependency and a high relationship anxiety. So for me, out of my relationship history, I don't want to give specific numbers, so I'll use percentages. About 25% of my relationship partners have been anxious attachers. And even though my longest relationship was with an anxious attacher, I actually really struggle with these individuals. I don't know how he and I made it last as long as we did. It's still a mystery to me. However, when we first started dating, we had been dating for about maybe 3 months. And at the time I was a smoker, he was not. So I would go outside and he would come with me. And it eventually got to a point where it was like, do you really need to come outside? Can I just get 5 minutes by myself? And I finally had to say to him after 3 months, like, if you do not back off and give me some space in this relationship, it's never going to work and I'm going to need to end it. Could I have been kinder and nicer with the way I said that? Absolutely. I was way too harsh. However, he did get the message and he did back off and give me some space, which was very helpful and helped our relationship progress. Another example is my mom. She is an anxious attacher. And I don't know how her and my dad actually made their relationship work. They were married 30 years until his death, but he's a dismissive avoidant. She's an anxious, preoccupied, and somehow they stayed together. So it can work. It just still blows my mind. But she is very clingy. Even in my early adult years, when I first got married, she insisted that she needed to know every detail about my schedule, where I was going, what I was doing. She could not let go of that control, and she still felt it necessary to kind of try to get involved in my life, even in things that were not necessary at that point in time. So even now, when we choose not to bring her to day events that my daughters and I are going to, she really feels that as a rejection, and she really feels that distance and gets very upset over it. Other things you might come across is that these individuals do have a high need for a lot of reassurance in the relationship, especially if there's an attachment wound or a fracture in the relationship. They're going to need and want more reassurance than what others might be willing to give. So this might be something like, after a fight, asking, do you still love me? Do you still care about me? Are we okay? Even in things like text messages, you can still see some of the anxious behaviors. This is kind of like where you didn't answer a text message because, I don't know, you were like with a patient or something, and next thing you know, you open your phone and you've got 20 messages from this individual who's asking why you haven't answered back. And this becomes a little problematic in today's society when we're looking at social media messages that say, well, everybody's got their phones in their hands 24/7. If they're not responding to you, it's because they don't care or something. That's not always the truth. Sometimes people are at work, sometimes people are busy, sometimes our phones aren't in our hand. That doesn't mean that we need to send, a lot of text messages asking for that reassurance. If you need reassurance, you should be able to ask your partner for reassurance and receive it. It shouldn't require a lot of text messages. One final thing that I've seen from anxious attachers and friends and family members that I haven't seen in some of the other attachment styles is this almost like inability to hold space for your emotions. So when you come to an anxious attacher because you're emotionally overwhelmed and upset by something and an experience is bothering you, I find that a lot of times they kind of twist it back to themselves. So you might be talking about how you had a really rough day at work. Their day was rougher. You might be talking about how an experience of being separated from them for whatever reason might have been very difficult for you. It was worse for them. And I've seen sometimes it can be like they monopolize that conversation. So even though they're not trying to dismiss your feelings, your emotions, your experience, that can sometimes be the impact of what actually happens because their emotional experience is very big, it seems to me. And I don't know what it's like to be in their shoes. I can only really observe what others tell me and what I see in the relationships that are around me. And again, I'm not referencing this off my clients because to me, again, that's inappropriate. But from what I've seen, what I've experienced when I've been in relationships with these individuals, especially romantic relationships, their emotional experience always takes center stage, and they need it to be dealt with before your experience can be dealt with. That can be problematic, and I think from a therapeutic standpoint, when we're talking about like a model like EFT, where one of the things we want to do is re-engage the withdrawer in the relationship. Usually an anxious attacher is the pursuer, trying to get that anxious attachment, that pursuer, to regulate enough to a point where they can take a break so we can focus on usually the dismissive avoidant withdrawer pattern and really focus in on what their experience is to get them re-engaged into this conversation before we bring that pursuer or that anxious attachment back in. So that's what I've seen, that's what I've experienced, is that the anxious attachers, they just really have such big emotions with such difficulty to self-regulate that I feel personally drained and exhausted because whatever I'm going through has just been kind of thrown out the window because I need to focus my attention on them. None of those are actually healthy behaviors. Really, we want that self-regulation to happen so that the co-regulation can happen, and that's something that the anxious attacher would be a skill that they actually need to learn. But I'll give you some helpful hints on that. So as we're wrapping up for today, a couple of final thoughts. If you are an anxious attacher and you want to move towards a secure attachment, here are some ideas that you can get started with. And you're probably going to need to be working with a therapist for some of this, so just keep an open mind as to what all of your options are. So first of all, you want to be able to know your values and needs. It's not surprising if you don't yet, but that's okay. A therapist can help you figure out what your values and needs are in a relationship and really refine those. You also want to start practicing independence. If anxious attachers really do depend on other people, you can actually start practicing those independence skills now with the help of a therapist. Make sure that if you're getting into a new relationship, you're communicating your wants and needs early. If your partner's not able to meet those needs, you're going to want to bring that relationship to its natural conclusion before those attachment bonds really take hold. So make sure you're communicating your needs early and you're being open, honest, and transparent about what you actually need. Make sure that you have a good support system of friends, family, whoever's in that network for you, so that you have people that you can discuss ideas with, bounce ideas off of them, and that they're also going to be there if you're struggling. Here's the tough one. Anxious attachers can struggle with maintaining boundaries. So you need to be able to explore what boundaries you need, be able to set those boundaries, and then actually be able to enforce them. What I've seen is anxious attachers might be able to explore and set, but can't always enforce. That might be a struggle point. So if you're an anxious attacher, it's really time to start learning about how to work with those boundaries. When you're questioning your behavior and is this appropriate or am I overreacting, that type of thing, ask yourself what a secure attacher would do. So again, remember, we're using secure attachment as that map of where we want to get to for that blueprint and that dance. You can go ahead and ask yourself, what's a secure attacher going to do in a situation like this if they were in it instead of me? And be able to try to choose some different behaviors. Practice asking for help when it's appropriate. You don't want to be dependent on other people to a point of codependency, but you do want to be able to ask for what you need help with in a relationship. Also, here's the big one, learning that emotional regulation, that self-soothing skill. This is where the therapist is a huge benefit because we can give you those skills. We can give you those regulation skills. We can practice them with you and we can send you home to practice them. And your romantic partner is probably going to trigger you at some point anyway, so you're going to get an opportunity to practice those skills at home. Then, as you're working on all of this, there's probably going to be a point where you're going to need to assess the current relationships that you're in to really determine whether or not they're healthy for you and if they're working for you. If you're an anxious attacher and you're in a relationship with a dismissive or a fearful avoidant, it may not be the best relationship for you. And so you might have to, as you grow and heal as a person, realize that not everyone is meant to come with you along the next part of your journey. So you might have to assess whether or not your current relationships are able to actually meet your needs. And if not, you might need to be prepared to see if those relationships can be adjusted or if it's time for them to come to their conclusion. So I hope this information helps you and that you can take it back to your therapist. And next time we'll talk about different attachment style.